Good afternoon and welcome back to the virtual VETS'20. Today is part 11 of our now 17-part webinar series hosted by the National Veteran Small Business Coalition. I'm Earl Morgan, the NVSBC Program Director, and to our new attendees, thank you for joining us today. We'd like to thank our 8 sponsors who made this webinar series possible. All right, today's webinar runtime is 1 hour and the webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions, please type them in the text box on the screen. We'll try to get to all the questions on this webinar, and if by chance we missed your question, you do not have time to answer it, we'll get the answers to you and post it on the virtual VETS'20 replay webpage. Now let me introduce our Executive Director for the National Veteran Small Business Coalition, Mr. Scott Jensen. Scott, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Earl. We, as always, we appreciate your support and helping us get to these wonderful VET'20 webinars. So thanks again for that. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're out on the West Coast. It's great to have everyone out here and joining us again today. Got a really great speaker today. I want to introduce Dave Schaefer from the law firm of Polero Mazza. Dave will get into more of the specifics of his legal practice, but let me just say that he's a very accomplished and experienced attorney who works across a broad spectrum of focused business issues and needs. He's a trusted general counsel and leads the firm's cybersecurity and data privacy team. Prior to his legal career and while in law school, Dave provided legal assistance for disabled veterans and also was a judicial intern in the U.S. District Court of the District of Maryland. And finally, close to my heart, Dave is a Marine Corps combat veteran. Dave, thanks for being with us today. It's great to have you on board, and I'll turn the floor over to you. We're really looking forward to this discussion.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Scott. I really appreciate the, I'll say, very generous introduction and quick biography. I do appreciate it. I do think you touched on a couple of things, from my background that really, gets me excited to work, to give this webinar and to really work with SDVOSBs and other veteran-owned small businesses. I am myself a veteran and obviously know several other veterans and very happy within my community to continue to help veterans not only while they're in the service, but also during the transitions and accomplish their goals. And I do like, for my legal pro bono practice, to process disability benefit appeals, to process any sort of discharge upgrades, and really, again, be involved within the veteran community. Certainly a part of the reason why I became an attorney was to be able to give back to that specific community. And so it brings me great joy to be here today to speak to that audience. And I would like to thank you, Earl, and of course the NVSBC family for allowing me to participate. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to having a good conversation with the attendees today. Again, if there are any questions, feel free to put them into the chat. We'll answer what we can. And if we don't know the answer, we'll get back to you as soon as we can with an appropriate answer. So
thanks, Dave.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we'll just jump right in. This is equity incentive programs. Strategies for an employee retention and strategic growth. As Scott said, I'm Dave Schaefer. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Polero Mazza. I work in the business and corporate group, so my practice, as he alluded to, kind of touches upon a lot of different facets associated with small businesses. Next slide. And now, because the attendees can't get enough of my face, there's another picture of me and a little bit of snapshot, again, as to what it is that I do. But I think we've probably belabored that point, and so no need to beat that any further. Next slide. Thank you, Earl. And so a little bit about Polero Mazza, just as a quick kind of touch point. Polero Mazza is a full-service law firm that is really catered toward small business and the government contracting community, though we do have clients in the commercial sector as well, and we offer a variety of services and issue solving. And I think ultimately we like to consider ourselves a trusted advisors to bounce any ideas off of, legal or other. So there's a quick little snapshot, but we're getting right down to it. Next slide. So what we're going to talk about today, again, as the name implies, incentive programs. So incentive programs, really we're going to give a very brief snapshot of the SDVOSB regulatory environment, the environment in that you're operating in, and then talk about what some of these incentive programs can do and what are their general purposes, because there's actually multiple ways to skin that cat and multiple purposes and things that we can do here. Strategic considerations, this is just one part of a larger web that is your business. There's a lot of complicating factors, and we want to make sure that it makes sense for you. Incentive plans available, we're talking about synthetic equity and true equity, and then implementation and integration. Again, how do we actually put this in practice into a practical and capable, sustainable, and manageable kind of process going forward? So we'll talk through each one of those briefly. Next slide. Great. So just again, on the SDVOSB regulatory environment, I understand that there are other slides and presentations, and I think that the attendee group is generally familiar with the SDVOSB program and the kind of constraints, the benefits and the constraints that are placed on businesses that are operating in that particular area of operation, so to speak. But I wanted to touch on just a couple ones that really relate to what we're going to talk about today. Unconditional and direct ownership being the first. And in this, there's even two, unconditional and direct. So unconditional is going to talk about the rights and the rights associated with ownership. We'll talk later about minority equity investors, bringing on venture capital, private equity, things along those lines as methods of strategic growth. And while that's not the focus of the presentation today, it's certainly something to kind of keep in the back of your mind, because ultimately what we're talking about with these incentive programs is growth and kind of throughout the life cycle of a business. So unconditional, we're talking about the qualifying individual, the SDV, maintaining certain rights, and others are just unable to have those same rights, or veto rights, negative controls, things along those lines. And direct ownership, which means you have to own it directly. You can't own the company through a holding company. You can't own it through a separate LLC. It has to be a direct ownership. And I bring that up because what that does right off the bat is eliminate profits interest if you were taxed as an S Corp. And so as a brief note on that, again, we're not going to talk about tax status. There's certainly other venues for that. But to the extent that you're a company that's taxed as an S corporation, whether you're an LLC or a corporation, for tax purposes, if you're taxed as an S corporation, you can't create a second class of equity. You can't, you can't have certain other requirements, like an entity cannot own the company, things along those lines. So that's kind of the space that we're working in. Financial benefits requirement. Again, if you own 51%, you have to get 51% of the profits and losses commensurate with your ownership interest. So those are types of financial and ownership considerations that come into play when we're trying to figure out what's the best fit for any of these plans. So next slide, please. Great. So to continue on that, the incentive plans, we're really talking about attracting and retaining talent, especially at the stage of early stage companies. Some of your best value is driven by your employees. We're looking for creative ideas. We're looking for people who have a lot of energy to go out and network, go out and build business, go out and kind of build a brand to which you're going to be able to market and leverage and continue to grow the business. But because of some of the things that I just mentioned, SDVs are actually in a little bit of a disadvantage as compared to their peers in the commercial market, right? You have those constraints. You have the compensation that the qualifying individual must remain the highest compensated individual. And you have the fact that even if you were to give out equity or to sell equity, you would still have to have 51% unconditional direct ownership of the company. So this causes us to be a little bit more creative and think a little bit outside of the box to make sure that we've really understood what are our options to make sure that you can grow the company that you envision. So next slide. So again, what are the purposes? And I bring up purposes because, I mean, obviously incentive plans, the name itself is self-explanatory. It's meant to incentivize, but there's a lot of different types of incentivizing. You know, what are you incentivizing towards? So it depends upon where you are in the stage, and we'll touch upon some considerations for early stage, some for more mature stage. But with regarding recruitment, you know, one of the things that incentive plans offer you to advertise to those individuals that you're recruiting is a potential upside, right? So sure, I might not be able to offer you as you know, much cash or compensation or benefits associated on day one, but I can pretend I can offer you upside, and that upside is going to be directly related to a lot of the effort that you put into the company. And it can be tailored such that those particular individuals, and maybe you're recruiting particularly ambitious individuals who have confidence that they are going to be able to help you grow your business, you're recruiting those particular individuals. So I talk about the stage of a company. So for recruiting at the very earliest stages, maybe those a broad-based plan, kind of more simple incentive plans are all that are really needed. But when you get to become a more mature company, perhaps you're looking to bring on your first CFO, your first COO, or you're looking for that kind of C-suite executive level individual to come get the company over the hump of what you may be experiencing in the market, then it might be a little bit different, where your recruitment strategy for incentive plans may just be a little bit more fulsome. At that point, maybe it is real equity instead of synthetic equity. So there's a lot of different things in which the plan can be tailored to who you're recruiting, depending on what stage of business you're in. Retention, same kind of concept. You've got these employees who've developed great working knowledge, great customer relationships. They're really valuable, and you want to make sure that A, just because you want to take care of your employees, you want to make sure that they get to participate in the upside, or B, you want to make sure that those particular employees don't leave, and you know, dovetail any sort of incentive plan with any sort of non-solicitation, non-confidentiality, non-compete kind of agreements that are already in place to make sure that you've really retained those individuals, and put in place a vesting schedule such that the incentive plan itself is subject to, say, a 4-year vesting plan, so that the participant has to stick around in order to really obtain the full benefit. And in that way, we've incentivized them to stay. Motivate, again, motivate towards what is usually the question that I ask a lot of clients. We can talk about appreciation of value, whether it's gross revenue, whether it's obtaining certain contracts, whether it's net value, EBITDA, things along those lines. They're typically objectively based on some sort of financial metric, but that really aligns their interest. They get a benefit when they hit the metric, and the shareholders in the company get a benefit when you hit that metric. So, you know, what are we motivating towards? There's a lot of purposes that could possibly be there. Next slide. And again, not one size fits all. So depending on who you're looking for, depending on what stage of your life cycle, whether you're just being formed, whether you're close to your exit strategy, whether you're looking to be sold to a strategic buyer or a private equity venture capital firm, whatever the case may be, you really want to, and the benefit of a lot of these incentive plans that I'm going to speak about, tailor this to the specific thing that you want to achieve. And that's what we're trying to do. Not just we want to have happy employees, which there's a lot of value in that too, but we want to incentivize them to achieve a goal that's mutually beneficial for everybody else. And so your goal is going to be different from every other business's goal. And so you really need to think about, what am I trying to achieve, and what are the kind of objective metrics that will tell me when we have achieved that. So, and with that, you really also want to think about your company culture, your talent pool, retention and motivation programs. Again, this is all part and parcel of a larger, broader scheme about how your company is operated, and you know, the individuals that you're trying to retain, promote, and you know, get in front of customers and things along those lines. So it's all got to integrate into other kind of employee welfare plans, ERISA plans, deferred compensation, 401k, you know, integrated within the full suite of plans to make sure that it all kind of works together. And again, thinking through ultimate goals, employee capabilities, commitments, make sure we're incentivizing the right people to do the right things. And that's sometimes very difficult to do. Next question, or next slide rather. So this is a quick sample of just some of the questions that we typically run through with our clients to kind of suss out exactly what are you trying to accomplish and what are the extenuating circumstances that may arise that may have cause us to adjust on the fly. You know, you lawyers tend to always play the what if game to try and play out these scenarios to make sure that the company is protected in the case of some sort of adverse employee action or things along those lines. But I'll run through these real quick. There's several other questions, but these are some of the more fundamental ones. So the first one is, do you want to share real equity or do you want to share synthetic equity? And we'll talk much more about the difference between the two, the pluses and minuses, pros and cons of each. If so, how much? You want to set a pool, right? So you don't want to necessarily dilute yourself and your ownership beyond that, which is reasonable. And so I would say right now, the pool kind of market terms is that for a standard employee incentive plan, not necessarily the C-suite, but for a standard employee plan, we're looking at 10 to 12% of the total economic value of the company being the maximum amount of the pool. You know, we want to make sure that we incentivize the employees, but the employees are still the employees, and the officers and owners rather are still taking the bulk of the risk. It's your name on the lease, it's your name on the bank documents, and your name on the business card. So, you know, you don't want to set the pool too high, but you certainly want to make sure that it's large enough to capture and provide a real benefit to those people. So the next question again, who gets to participate? Sometimes, again, if you're just looking at bringing on a CFO, you're bringing on a business development manager, you're bringing on somebody at that C-suite level, it might make sense that the plan only relates to them. They're more valuable. They have a long-term, they can provide a much larger long-term benefit to the company. But otherwise, you can also do rank and file. If the rank and file employees are instrumental to the business, they've been grinding day in and day out, it's perfectly fine to allow them to participate as well. It just might not be to the same amount, but really we're talking about defining the value of these individuals and what's the benefit that they could provide from a long-term perspective. So, and additionally, under these benefit plans, you can include outside consultants, and that comes into play as well. If you say want a board of advisors, a board of directors, you want to incentivize certain individuals to give you advice to work with you on a part-time capacity, this is a great way to attract a really sophisticated advisory board that's going to allow you to continue to, you know, use their knowledge and their experience to grow your business or make connections and things along those lines. So not only are we talking about growth from internal, talking about bringing in an external advisory board and making sure that they feel incentivized to help you out as well. How and when, or what are you rewarding? Value since inception, future growth, company-wide division. Again, this is a very, very tailorable approach. You know, you can reward the technology division and you know, not the widget division, because this one's falling behind. We really want to incentivize them to grow, or we see a potential market opportunity there, and so it's all very tailorable. It doesn't have to be applied across the board. So, how and when will payment occur? Will the company have liquidity to make payments? Certainly, something that we always want to keep in mind is that when the company incurs an obligation to pay something, particularly to their employees, you want to make sure that you're capable of making that payment. And so typically what we'll say is when the payments occur, the payments will occur upon certain triggering events, and those triggering events tend to be liquidity events in which everybody's making money. So there's a pot of money to draw from. How is it earned? Subject to forfeiture. What if a vested participant terminates employment? And these again are some of the things that you think about when we talk about, let's say that I provide an incentive plan, I provide equity or synthetic equity to a particular individual, and then we have to terminate that individual. Well, if we terminate them with cause, we terminate them without cause. If they terminate themselves, if they voluntarily resign, if they voluntarily resign because of certain issues and instances for good reason, if they death or disability, there's a variety of different circumstances in which an employee or a recipient under these plans would depart the company. And when they do, what happens? Do they forfeit their equity? Do they have to sell back their equity? Do they forfeit their right to participate in future financing events? And so again, for some people, you say, well, it can go to your estate upon death, but if you resign without, if you just resign without giving any reason, if there's no real reason, you just resign, or if I terminate you without cause, then you forfeit. So again, this goes back to retention. If somebody resigns and they forfeit, then they're more likely to stick around. And so again, we're really talking about recruitment, retention, and motivation, and how do we utilize these to accomplish those goals. Next slide. Okay, so equity plans versus synthetic equity plans. So there's a decent amount of differences, but these are kind of the main bullet points, and I'll touch upon some of the more material issues here, more material points. In an equity plan, a holder receives real, true equity. So they receive the same stock, membership interest, partnership interest that the other owners have. They become a true owner of the company. Now that certainly means that there are certain fiduciary duties that the majority owner would now incur that relate to minority owners, depending upon the jurisdiction that you are organized in and the jurisdiction in which you operate. There are certain fiduciary duties: act in the best interest of the corporation, act in the best interest, duty of loyalty, duty of care, things along those lines. So they may be triggered, and you may have an obligation to look after, so to speak, that minority owner, and you may not want that additional fiduciary duty. Voting, dividend, other rights associated with ownership, to the extent that you are a partnership or you're taxed as an S corporation, you have to make tax distributions. Presumably under your organizational documents, you make tax distributions. You'd have to make tax distributions to that particular individual. Voting, again, they would now have an opportunity to vote just as any other shareholder or member. So those are some of the more kind of control type considerations to take into account. The next one, it says typically some capital investment is required. This one comes up a lot because what we're really talking about with this is front-end tax. So we hear a lot that a company has an employee, they've been doing great work for 5 years, and we'd really like to reward them with some stock. And we'd like to give them stock. And we'd like to give them that stock in consideration for the 5 years of faithful service they've given to the company. Well, when you give them that stock has value, and that is a taxable event to the recipient, right? Just as if you were paying them a cash bonus that would be taxable, the stock is also taxable to them. So if you gave them $100,000 worth of stock, they are going to have to pay taxes on that $100,000 worth of stock at the ordinary income rate within the tax year that they received that. So what you could inadvertently do is give your employee something, a very well-intentioned portion of ownership of the company that is going to appreciate, and it's going to be wonderful down the road. But for this year, you just gave them, potentially a $37,000 tax bill that they were not anticipating. And then any attempt of the company to pay that tax bill on behalf of the employee, well, that is also taxed because that's more compensation going to the employee. So you get into a little bit of a circular kind of reasoning. So it's definitely something to make sure that the employee understands and that you understand from an employee kind of morale positioning and making sure that, they aren't caught off guard by those types of things. So I would say if true equity as an incentive plan is something that you're considering, it would be prudent to talk with your accounting or legal team to talk through the tax implications to make sure that, again, the recipient is fully aware of any tax obligations. And they can talk you through any sort of vesting or 83B elections to minimize taxes, but it is a taxable event. So, but on the backside, when they sell that stock, it's taxed at the capital gains rate being less than the ordinary income rate. And so they're only taxed on the capital gains rate as from the appreciation in value. So they get a tax benefit when they sell. Now to synthetic equity plans. On synthetic equity plans, touching upon the control piece, that's not real equity, so they don't have rights as a true stockholder or a true member. This is really an economic right, not an ownership right. It's designed to mirror an ownership right. So it's synthetic equity, so it's phantom equity is another phrase you'll hear a lot. So it's not real equity, but it's designed to mimic equity. So on the positive side, you can issue that to an employee because they didn't receive anything of value at the time of issuance. It is not a taxable event to that employee when they receive it. It is just a contractual right. It's not real equity. So therefore, they don't have any sort of tax obligation on the front end. On the back end, however, when a trigger event happens and they get paid the amount associated with the synthetic equity, at that point, they get taxed at the ordinary income rate. So they pay more taxes on the back end, but they incur less taxes on the front. So as you can see with this kind of distinction between equity and synthetic equity, we really come down to two things. Number one is control and all of those kind of SDVOSB regulatory concerns that we talked about previously. And number two is taxes and making sure that everyone's on the same page with all of the rights and limitations associated with each and any sort of payment obligation that's going to be incurred by the recipient. So as with a lot of things in business, tax tends to drive the conversation. So it's important to make sure that you're up to speed and make sure that, more importantly, that the employee or the recipient rather is up to speed on that. Next slide. So these are some of the, in our experience, some of the things, some of the best incentive models for SDVOSBs kind of working within that constraint. Right off the bat, it's one we haven't really talked about at all yet, is just a very simple cash bonus plan. It's simple, but it's effective. And this is really good for short-term goals, right? You want to make sure, of course, before you implement something like this, you anticipate that you're going to have the liquidity to pay it. You certainly don't want to get into a situation where you owe your employee a substantial amount of money and you don't have the revenue or growth in order to pay it, the liquidity really. So, but this is for an annual goal. This is for division growth, recruiting goals, very short-term things. We're looking at just rewarding incremental growth, okay? So it's something that, and maybe I should have said, with regards to integration and implementation, as I'll touch on later, but all of these can be, you know, you don't have to limit yourself to just one. You can integrate them and make sure that they provide a good, strong web of employee benefit plans. Broad-based qualified plans. This is more of the cultural piece because it is broad-based. 401k plans, you know, profit sharing plans, those types of things. ESOPs. ESOPs are a great way to get employees involved. It's also, depending on the stage of company, it's also a very good way to do an exit strategy, particularly for SDVOSBs. You'll find that at the time in which you want to maybe exit the company, you want to sell your company, that it could be limiting to find a potential buyer. And so one of the things you can do is create an ESOP. And without getting into the details of how ESOPs work, it's a potential opportunity to gain some exit liquidity without having to actually find a buyer. Okay. Equity plans, again, we just kind of touched upon some of the pros and cons on equity plans. It is something that I would say it still happens, but typically that's with key employees. And there's a variety of different bells and whistles that we would put on an equity plan to make sure that it really fits into the incentivization model, whether that's vesting restricted units instead of straight units, restricted stock, restricted units, those types of considerations, putting it kind of a little bit more holistic for that kind of C-suite and how that would integrate with them. And then synthetic equity plans, which we mentioned again, another long-term business goal. These are great incentivization drivers, and it's providing that kind of compensation that is related to the equity value, but is not the equity value itself. There's a couple there's a variety of types. There's stock appreciation rights, there's phantom equity plans. Phantom equity is the most common. It's the one that we see the most. So we're going to, I'll kind of go through that in a little bit more detail so that we can really think through how that can be tailored. Next slide. Okay. So again, phantom equity plans, as the name implies, phantom, not real equity, but phantom equity plans tend to be the most popular. They tend to be the most popular because A, you're not giving up any sort of real equity. Therefore, you're nice and neatly within the SDVOSB regulatory environment. You're also nice and neatly within any sort of S-Corp taxation regulatory environment, which a lot of small businesses, again, are taxed as S-Corps. And so in the Venn diagram of benefit plans, this tends to be the one that kind of checks all the boxes and is nice right in the middle. So what a phantom equity plan is really, it's a contractual right to receive money in the future, and the amount of money is tied to the value of the equity of the company. So as it says here, unfunded, unsecured promises to pay money in the future, right? So you don't have to put any money into a bank account to be held in escrow. You don't have to put any stock into escrow. You don't have to fund this at the date in which you put it in place. You just have to enter into a fulsome phantom equity plan, and then you have to give out phantom equity awards or grants depending upon certain criteria. So now we're in it. So it's a deferred compensation plan that falls under the ERISA code of the tax section, but it's a deferred compensation plan. So the deferred is kind of critical. You don't have to fund it up front, and it's not secured. So if you fail to make a payment, it's not as if that particular employee gets equity as a result. They would have a contractual right to ask for the payment, but it's not secured by any assets. It's not secured by any sort of equity. So it minimizes the downside risk. So the characteristics that make this attractive is, again, no tax up front for the holder, for the recipient. They don't have to pay any sort of tax up front. They get to hold on to it. When a triggering event happens, they get cash, and they get cash in an amount that's pretty objective. So I'll talk about that real briefly. So let's say today, September 15th, the value of your company is $1 million. And you give somebody, you create a pool, a phantom equity pool of 10%. And so we've got a $100,000 pool, and we give somebody phantom equity that's worth $50,000. So that is their grant date value, right? And so we're saying they have 5% of the economic value of the company after all that math kind of shakes out. And then 4 years from now, we've grown the company, we've acquired some other companies, or we've got some good contracts, and we hit a triggering event, and I'll touch upon that in a moment. We hit a triggering event, and now that 5% is worth $100,000. We've doubled. The company's now worth $2 million. That 5% is now doubled. So the individual now gets the benefit, and upon the triggering event, gets a $50,000 check, and they have to pay tax at the ordinary income rate on that. But that's money that they would not have received had the triggering event not occurred, but they get the benefit of that appreciation. So again, we're incentivizing them to grow the pie as much as possible because their percentage of the pie will remain constant. So the bigger the value of the company is upon a triggering event, the more payment they will get. So it's that delta between the value of the grant date and through kind of the triggering event in which they actually receive the money. At that point, that delta, they're incentivized to grow that. Of course, the more percentage they have, the more benefit they get, and the more they're going to be incentivized to grow it. So your CFO that you bring in is going to get more phantom equity shares than your rank and file employees, though all can participate again. And so it's this very nice kind of straightforward, please incentivize us to continue to grow. Now, on the grant date, like I said, let's say the value is $50,000. You can actually grant them phantom equity at a valuation of $0 so that they get to take advantage of more upside. And sometimes with more sophisticated employees or C-suite executives, they're going to negotiate exactly what that dollar amount should be so that they can maximize their upside potential. But generally speaking, it's the fair market value of the company as of the grant date, because you don't want to give them credit for the growth of the company that they were not there to help facilitate. We really only want to give people credit for the growth. And if the company does not grow, and the company goes down, and then there's a trigger event, then that particular participant doesn't receive any compensation. So again, we're de-risking this kind of incentive plan for the company. And upon these triggering events, you have the liquidity to make those payments. So what are these kinds of triggering events? So triggering events tend to be the sale of the company, right? So eventually, whether you intend to sell within 5 years or longer, you know, whatever the life cycle of the company may be that suits your particular needs, at that particular event, you want them to grow it so that you can sell it for as large a value as you can. And so at that event, when the sale takes place, the company will at that point have the money to do so. So the trigger events tend to be sale of substantially all of the assets or all of the equity of the company, essentially selling the company. It could be meeting a revenue target, could be meeting some sort of objective metric with regards to gross revenue, EBITDA, or profit. It could be annual, so you could pay somebody distributions, or really it's contractual payments that mirror distributions that you make to other equity holders. So in that way, you can make it look just like equity, but retain all of the control and give them no voting rights and things along those lines. So it is pretty tailorable for the most part. When you give somebody phantom equity or synthetic equity that looks and acts just like real equity, it's not so much as a growth incentive, but more of a retention incentive. And when you give somebody equity that only gets paid out upon that maturity event, upon that triggering event in the future, that's much more of the incentive to grow the pie as much as possible. And again, as mentioned on the last slide, it can also be just for this division, or it could be for the company as a whole. So those are some of the characteristics. And again, it's very tailorable, and you can put in multiple plans, and you can make it as nuanced as you want. So, but then again, we have to consider what happens when. You know, what happens when the employee decides to move on, but all of their phantom equity plans are vested. Typically, if that is the case, then if a triggering event happens within 12 months following the vesting date, they get to take part in the benefit, because theoretically, the value that they have given to the company, the goodwill, that kind of sweat equity, if you will, has persisted for 12 months. And you can make an argument that their actions have helped lead to this particular triggering event. But after 12 months, it becomes far too attenuated and somewhat diluted. And so at the 12-month mark, it's forfeited and no longer of any force or effect. And all of that goes back into the pool and capable of being reissued out to others, maybe their replacement, or to redistribute it amongst the group, depending on how the plan committee and the board of managers, directors, or whoever is running the company, however they decide. So death, disability, change of control, those different types of things, you just really have to kind of think through to make sure that you're getting the full benefit of the incentive plan. You don't want someone to have all of their phantom vest, then they leave, they stop giving you the benefit, but they get to just keep sitting on it and essentially squat on these rights until a payday comes and they get a large payday, but they didn't actually have to do all of the work in order to get that payday. So again, a lot of what ifs, a lot of when ifs, and those different types of things. Considerations, again, we want to make sure it's tied to company performance. That's what we're here to talk about. Want to make sure that the employees are helping the company as a whole, and how does that relate to the culture? How does that really integrate into the rest of the plans and into the rest of the benefits that are being offered? Okay, next slide. Oop, back one. There we go. So, so that is kind of, again, the most popular. Phantom equity tends to be the most popular, and though there are others, but that's the most popular synthetic equity. And in real equity, we're just going to talk briefly about investment considerations, which we touched upon at the outset. So typically in a more commercial enterprise, you talk about a Series Seed round, a Series A round, a Series B round, Series C, and so on and so forth until private equity infusion and IPO and all of these different types of kind of growth opportunities. And while those are available to SDVOSBs, and we have done a fair amount of those types of venture capital transactions, the SDVOSB regulations really inhibit the ability of a company to go out and seek that kind of more traditional growth trajectory, because venture capital firms, private equity firms, those sophisticated investors who are looking to invest in early stage growth stage companies typically don't like kind of their limited rights that are afforded to them under these types of arrangements. So it becomes a little bit of a business point and a little bit of a discussion, but it does happen, and it's certainly something to kind of keep in mind. When we talk about growth, we talk about organic growth and inorganic growth. The phantom equity plans and the employee incentive programs are really about organic growth. We're growing the pie from within. Investments from outside third parties can help you pursue inorganic growth. So for example, somebody provides the company, invests a lot of money into the company, and you're required to use that money to buy other companies. If that's potentially the best way for you to acquire a competitor, acquire a specific division of a competitor, or whatever the case may be, you can grow your market share through a variety of different means, organic and inorganic. So, there's multiple opportunities to kind of grow the pie. So again, as I've said a couple times now, it's all about integrating them within your overarching business plan and your exit strategies. But with that in mind, I just wanted to touch upon some of these investment considerations for SDVOSBs. Again, the SDV must have 51% fully diluted ownership of every class of interest. So if you created a Series A preferred, the SDV has to own 51% of the Series A preferred. If you created just a Series B or a C stock or whatever the case may be, it's 51% direct ownership across the board. And so the direct, again, prohibits holding companies, which is a mechanism that a lot of venture capital firms really enjoy using. Investors have to understand limitations on controls. There's essentially 5 negative controls that an investor could have. And when I say negative controls, it's essentially a provision in your operating agreement or within a voting agreement, shareholders agreement, that says the company cannot do these 5 things unless you get unanimous approval or you get the approval of this particular minority investor. And they tend to be things that are considered, quote, extraordinary, so outside of the ordinary course of business. And they tend to be things that relate to the value of that person's investment. So the 5 are, real quickly, addition of a new equity holder. So they can't be diluted because the value of their investment would therefore go down. Dissolution of the company, so you can't just close up shop. Sale of the company, merger of the company, or putting the company into bankruptcy. As you can see from that list of 5, it's a pretty short list that doesn't really give much, if any, genuine control to any minority investor. And so therefore, all the day-to-day and strategic decision-making are left to the SDV. And so you've really got to make sure that you've got a strong board presentation materials, you've got a real clear business plan, and you've got a good pitch to get people excited to forfeit some of the more customary rights that they would see in the commercial marketplace, but get them excited that they continue to push forward and invest in your company and help perhaps go from the small business space into the, other than small business space, really kind of making that leap and growing in maturity and looking out for others. So board rights are certainly something that investors look for. Convertible note instruments are another way to essentially mimic a venture capital fund raise without selling true equity. You sell them debt, you sell them promissory notes that convert into equity. And depending upon the terms of that, that tends to, we would just make sure that it doesn't run afoul of the present effect rule under GovCon regs. So, I like to mention kind of the investment considerations, because again, we're talking about growth for the company inside, organic, inorganic, external, organic, inorganic, lots of opportunities out there. Next slide. Ooh. Final considerations, and then we'll see if there are any questions, but final considerations are, again, recruit, retain, motivate. How does your plan accomplish these objectives? What are you really trying to accomplish? If you have a clear end goal in mind, you can break down the metrics that's going to help you get there. Vesting via time, vesting via milestone. Who do I need to do that? I need a business development manager. I need a CFO. I need, a controller. I need these types of individuals to come in and provide some value that's going to help me become a little bit more sophisticated, attract a little bit more work, those types of things. And how does this get them there? Do I want to have additional share or unit holders? Again, sometimes even if you do want to give equity, true equity is a lot harder to have somebody sell back to you. Essentially, once they are an equity holder, it's going to be very difficult to get rid of them. And so while you might really enjoy these employees now, or these relationships that you have, we've seen far too many times that 10 years down the road, we've got partners who just aren't talking. One of them wants to buy the other one out. The other one just doesn't want to play ball. So once you really make that commitment, it's a pretty tough commitment to break, unless you agree at the outset how to get out of that kind of relationship. But unlike a synthetic equity in which it's still an employee and you can terminate that employee, if you have an equity holder that's an employee, you can terminate them and their employment, but you cannot terminate them and their relationship as an equity holder, kind of wearing two different hats. So you really need to think hard about whether you're giving that person the right to sit at the table, because you're not going to be able to get them out of that table without potentially a fight, unless you address that contractually prior to them gaining the equity. Thoughts on repurchase rights? Kind of dovetails on what we just talked about. If somebody leaves, if I fire them, can I just buy them back out? Do I have to buy them back out? What if I don't have the liquidity to buy them out? I really need this person out. Can I give them a promissory note? Do I have to take a bank loan? If they die, do I have key person life insurance in order that the insurance company is the one that actually funds the buyout? Those different types of considerations that would usually be baked into a shareholders agreement, into an operating agreement. Liquidity to fund the cash needs of the plan. Make sure that when there is a triggering event, when you reach the goal that you're incentivizing them to, that triggering event has some cash associated with it, because that contractual obligation to make that payment will become due, and you've got within 30 days to actually cut the check to the recipient to make sure that you're in compliance with the plan. Are you keeping it simple so that the company and the recipients easily understand the plan? This is last, but probably the most important. Everything that we've talked about it can tend to get a little complicated, and it gets a little complicated again because it's really tailorable, and you can adjust it as you need to fit your needs. But because of that, it tends to become a little bit of a choose your own adventure, and it's really hard to track all of the potential avenues that a plan could go through. And a lot of, depending on the profile of your holders, of your recipients, a lot of them are not really going to be able to understand exactly what they're looking at. In those particular circumstances, we often host town halls and give kind of presentations and walk through the documentation with people, because you want to make sure that they understand it, that there's no miscommunications about what they're getting and what they should expect. And as I mentioned at kind of that equity versus synthetic equity slide, this becomes particularly important if there's going to be a material tax liability that comes by signing up for the plan or by receiving equity. You really want to make sure that they easily understand that plan, because if they do not, you're just setting yourself up for some sort of dispute. And even if it doesn't incur legal costs, and even if it doesn't go to court, or even if it doesn't become that big of a problem, you've still got a pretty upset employee that just isn't good for business and isn't good for morale around the water cooler, so to speak. So very important that everyone's on the same page and understands it. And that's how you can kind of cut off those issues. So next slide, I suppose. And so to the extent that there are any questions, I'm certainly happy to talk through any that I can respond to. And if not, again, happy to reach back out after the fact.
Thanks, Dave. We sure appreciate it. That was incredibly enlightening and very thorough. The only question we got in is where can we get the slides, and we will make sure they get posted and a link goes out to you all. And I suspect that, as you alluded to in your discussion, that the circumstances are so unique to the individual company and the individual business owners that the questions generated may require some outreach. And so we appreciate your willingness to share your email and phone number. And as always with our friends at Polaro Mazza, who support business so well and support MVSBC, we know you're good for that outreach. So thanks so much for being willing to help our team out there.
Absolutely. You're totally right. These questions tend to be very nuanced into their specific circumstances, because every circumstance is different and every goal is different. And again, that's one of the great things that I really enjoy about my job, is helping SDVOSBs and other veteran-owned small businesses really achieve those metrics and help you integrate it with everything else. So absolutely feel free to reach out, email, phone. Myself, my colleagues at Polaro Mazza, always happy to help, and really enjoy being a part of this community and really think of it as a community. So thank you again, Scott and Earl and the rest of the MVSB family, for inviting me to present today. And I hope that everyone enjoyed it, at least learned something. And if not, sorry.
I don't think you have much to apologize for. That was great. And we thank everyone who joined us in attending today. And again, we can't speak highly enough of Dave's firm, Polaro Mazza, and their expertise and the support that they give. When they say ask, reach out, they really do mean it. So we thank you again, and wish you all a great rest of your morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at. We'll see you all again soon. Thanks, Dave. We'll talk to you real soon.
Pleasure. Bye.
See you later.